was that?
Thank you, Mr. President, for availing yourself again to come and assist the Commission so that you could complete your evidence relating to your position as former Deputy President of the party and President of the party, and continue or start evidence relating to your position as former Deputy President of the country and current President of the country. Thank you for availing yourself. Let's do the oath. I think last time it was the oath, Mr. President, it was not an affirmation. May I ask you please to rise so that we can take the oath. Please state your full names for the record, Mr. President.
Cyril Ramaphosa.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No, I do not have any objection to taking the prescribed oath.
Do you consider the oath binding on your conscience?
Yes, I consider the oath binding on my conscience.
Do you swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. You may be seated. Yes, Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. President. If you would agree, please, to remove your mask because the sound will not carry to the transcription. The social distancing is sufficient, we think, to protect all concerned. And if you could just switch on your microphone, please. Is it on? Great, thank you. Just to give an overview, Chair, today and tomorrow, I will conclude questions, hopefully within an hour, in relation to the previous appearance of the President in his capacity as President and Deputy President of the African National Congress. When that has been done, the President has asked to make an opening statement to introduce the next phase of the questioning dealing with the President's capacity as President of the country. After that, there will be questions from evidence leaders of certain of the state-owned entities concerning which evidence has been led. Advocate Seleka will question on affairs related to Eskom, Advocate Soni in relation to affairs related to PRASA, and Advocate Myberg in relation to Transnet. That should conclude the proceedings today, and then tomorrow I will ask questions of a general nature in relation to the President and his capacity as President of the country. We've agreed under your direction, Chair, to begin at 9 o'clock every day and go hopefully at least until, but as far as I'm aware, until 5 o'clock every day.
Okay. The stopping time, Mr. President, is that fine with you? At 5 o'clock?
I was told that the stopping time for the Commission is usually 4 p.m.
Yes, yes.
So,
there might have to be some discussions to see whether you would be available beyond 4 o'clock.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
We can have a discussion, yes.
Okay, no, that's fine. That discussion can happen during the tea break and lunch break.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, yes. Thank you.
And Chair and Mr. President, although every attempt has been made to distinguish clearly between questions relating to your capacity as President of the party and questions relating to your capacity as President of the country, there may be some grey areas where it's not possible to define the distinction clearly, but we can deal with that when the time comes. We have provided your office, Mr. President, with a substantial volume of documentation. I'm not going to go through the detail, but they're contained in the bundles behind you. In addition, certain documentation has been provided to us from your office and elsewhere. Those documents are also provided in the bundles behind you. But your statement is in bundle 3 behind you, and documents annexed in bundle 4.
Sure.
And then as preparation proceeded, a further bundle entitled the reference bundle has been compiled. There is at least one document that you've not had an opportunity to read, I understand, but by tomorrow, I think sufficient time has been agreed to be made available. I won't deal with any documents that you haven't looked at unless we discuss it first. Mm-hmm. Then, Chair, I'm conscious of constraints of time. In order to conclude the evidence relating to the issues raised at the President's last appearance, ideally one would have wanted a lot more time, but I'm going to try and complete that in an hour to give the other evidence leaders sufficient time today to complete their questions.
Yes, okay.
Mr. President, there are two issues really that remain to be dealt with in general terms from your last appearance. The first issue is the issue of deployment and questions related to deployment. The second issue is the issue of accountability and discipline within the party, and hopefully we can conclude those questions within the hour. But you will recall during your evidence there were at least 3 forms of appointment at the hands or related to the deployment committee that we discussed. There was the hard definition, the definition which illustrates that the deployment committee in effect instructs and commands in relation to appointments. Then there was the soft definition where, according to evidence given before the Commission on behalf of the ANC, the deployment merely makes a recommendation to the appointing authority or entity and no more. Then we discussed that there was a space in between those extremes where in substance and reality, the deployment committee did impose its will on the appointing authority, although not in so many words, simply by the exercise of its leadership and power. And then we also discussed other forms of appointment where there's no intervention by the deployment committee at all in accordance with its own principles, but simply an appointment. For example, an appointment by the former president, and I think you conceded once on one occasion by yourself. And in the deployment committee minutes, to which we will refer in due course, you apologized to the deployment committee for having done that. But as I understand it, that is the framework within which the issue of deployment was discussed last time around. The position of the legal team, or certainly in relation to the questions we're going to put, is that the soft definition of employment, mere recommendation, and no more, is not borne out by the facts. There is strong evidence that has been led before the Commission that in fact the deployment committee commands or instructs or in fact makes the relevant appointments. The SOE evidence leaders will put this to you in the context of government in relation to state-owned entities. But there has been other evidence, which we discussed last time around, from Messrs. Ngubane, Leighton Ngubane, Brown, and others. I'm not going to repeat that. But the answer to any disagreement between yourself and Mr. Mantashe on the one hand, and the evidence led before the Commission on the other, would lie in the Deployment Committee minutes. There we would have a contemporaneous record of the decisions that the Deployment Committee actually made in any particular period. And we've requested those from the attorneys for the ruling party. We've been told, firstly, that there are no minutes for the period 2012 to 2017. And I would just like to ask a question or two about that. When we are told that there are no minutes, are you aware whether there were minutes kept, but they have somehow been lost or destroyed, or whether simply when you were chair of the Deployment Committee, no minutes were taken? What is the position?
Chairperson, on the question of minutes, when I was chair of the Deployment Committee, I do not recall ever having to go through the minutes of the previous meeting. We always tended to deal with the issues at hand on a contemporaneous basis as they were presented. And quite often it would be either ministers who would come and say, we have shortlisted, there are so many applicants, and we would deal with that, and that would be done. And so I do not recall, when I was chair, any minutes being put forward for adoption, which is what often happens when you are a member of a committee, that minutes would be submitted, gone through and approved and adopted. So I do not recall, and I think you can ascribe that to rather unfortunate record-keeping processes, because in the main, the ANC has so many meetings, one after the other, so many committees, and I think those who are in charge will just take notes and just record a decision, and it's then communicated. So that would be my answer. But it has come to light now that the latter deployment committee process, which is, now being, not guessed, but which is being chaired by the Deputy President, there are proper processes and minutes are kept. And I think it would be those minutes that may have been submitted.
Two questions in that regard, if I may, Mr. President. The first is that generally I understand that in the ruling or governing party and its history, there is a practice of taking minutes in matters or meetings of import. Is that not correct?
Yes, it is.
And secondly, it would be particularly important in the affairs of a deployment committee where ministers would meet with the committee over a period of time and over the period of more than one meeting to have a record. It seems rather strange that, A, there were no minutes or no minutes available. As I understand your answer, you're not saying there were no minutes as a matter of fact, but just that you don't recall minutes being taken.
Yes.
Do you have any comment on that? It just seems improbable that there weren't minutes.
It may well sound improbable, but the minister or the person who would be bringing names or proposing names would rise from that meeting either immediately or thereafter, having been told by the SGO, and it would usually be the Deputy Secretary General, that the committee discussed this and it was comfortable with this and this proposition or proposal, and that is what would then happen. So I think the lapses of not really having those minutes should be understood within the context of an organization that's always on the go, that's always handling so many other processes. And indeed, yes, I mean, there are minutes that are also kept of either the working committee or the National Executive Committee. Those are like bigger and overarching structures. And we also have other committees, like what we call NEC committees, and those deal with policy matters. And if one were to dig, you would find that even those would deal with a paper and no real substantive minutes would be taken. It is clearly something, Chair, that needs to be improved. And it's part of what I have dubbed the renewal process, that we have dubbed the renewal process. We need to renew our own internal processes at an organizational, even administrative level, as well as our own political processes to deal with challenges that the organization faces from time to time, on an ongoing basis, rather, really.
We did then request the minutes of the Deployment Committee for the period post-2017, in other words, 2018 to 2021, and we received those. We requested them a month ago and received those on Friday evening. I'm not going to go into the reasons for the delay there. It's a collateral issue. But the records we have, and they're in the bundle before you, and I'd like to ask some questions about that. But before I do, can I ask, as far as you're concerned, was there any shift in policy or practice between the time when you were chair of the committee and the time where Mr. Mabuza was chair of the committee? Was there a change in policy known to you?
No, there wouldn't have been a change in policy. I think maybe a change in practice, because Deputy President Mabuza has tended to send ministers back and say, go back and process this again, and they would go back, sometimes pulling their hair out, and yet in my time the committee always found a way, but I guess his way maybe is much more effective. So the practice, yes, but the policy broadly, no. Policy largely in line with what I would say I described, which was also what National Chairperson of the ANC, Gwede Mantashe, also described.
The description you've just given of the approach of Deputy President Mabuza is in fact consistent with evidence you gave last time round about ministers coming back in frustration to the committee several times. And in fact, that evidence is consistent with the minutes, and I'll explain how we see it in a moment. But we can go through the minutes. It will take much longer than an hour, and I'm not sure that I have the time or capacity to do so. But
I haven't read them as well, that's the problem.
Well, perhaps we can spend a few minutes tomorrow on them by leave of the chair, because I do think it's important. We've reviewed those minutes, and certain themes emerge from those minutes. Now, we cannot obviously deal with the merits of each case because we don't have those facts. We only have the minutes and what emerges as a practice or policy from a reading of those minutes at face value. So, of course, it's subject to the facts of each particular case, and I must concede that in asking you these questions. But on our view, a general review of the minutes indicates that in large part, not always, but in large part, the hard definition that I've referred to, the deployment committee decides and instructs. That's the first proposition. Perhaps I can go through the propositions, you can consider them, and then we can decide what to do. The second issue is that the recommendation doesn't go from the committee to the appointing authority. It's the other way around. The minister or the appointing authority recommends, and it's the deployment committee that in its wisdom and according to its practice makes a decision, and that decision is then communicated. It's not universal, but it's by far the predominant way the deployment committee goes about its work in relation to appointing authorities. The third point that emerges is that on several occasions, certainly on more than isolated occasions, ministers come to the deployment committee and seek permission. Permission is the word that is used to proceed with the appointment process. And then the deployment committee will give the minister permission to proceed with appointment. Ministers are called to account by the deployment committee for presenting a fait accompli or presenting names to cabinet not approved by the disciplinary committee. There is a strict procedure that is often referred to that the ministers are called to account to follow under the supervision and direction, and I stress direction, of the committee, deployment committee. There are several occasions on which loyalty to the ruling party, party membership, and or hesitate to use the word subservience, but compliance with party prescripts is an issue which is relevant to the appointment. On occasions, and you've testified to this yourself, Mr. President, ministers' recommendations are not approved. They're sent back to the minister for, and the word is refinement. We're not accepting it. We'll consider it again when you come back to us. And that's consistent with your evidence, and we'll go back to that in a moment. There's even an occasion or occasions where the deployment committee insists that even before posts are advertised, that the deployment committee should be notified. But consistently throughout the minutes during this period, after you became president, to the present, to 2021, decisions are made in regard to appointments by the deployment committee. Final decisions which are imposed on the appointing authority. That is the language used. We can go through examples of the minutes, or you can perhaps take an opportunity to read overnight and we can revert to it briefly tomorrow. But what is your comment in that regard?
No, I think we should deal with it now, with respect. Chairperson, it is said that maybe the hard definition of the deployment committee's work is what has always prevailed. And as Mr. Pretoria says, maybe not all the time, but most of the time, I'd like to say that much as it may appear like it's the hard approach where it's instruct and command, in the end, there is, even if that were so, which I'd like to dispute in a minute, in the end, there is some safety net or process, because in the end, even the ANC concedes this, even in its conference resolutions and its internal processes, that for government positions, in the end, the legally mandated process must be followed. Entirely, because there is in the current cabinet a non-ANC member, and they're independent, and they raise issues and questions, and for the most part, some of their questions would be about competence, would be about ability for the person to do the work or not. So much as it could be said that the hard approach, which is instruct, could have been used, when it goes through to cabinet, that is the filter. The filter then will finally come out with an outcome that may not have been, say, commanded by the Employment Committee. But I would like to dispute this hard definition and say, as far as I'm concerned, it's more the soft one, and it may well appear like it is the hard one. It's the soft one by sheer operation, because it's not an appointing committee. It does not appoint by definition and by its own existence. In the last evidence I gave here, I said it's a recommending committee. It recommends and proposes. And Chair, this is what happens in the, if you like, the political landscape also for our country. I did refer to an incident of another party, which is in government in one province in our country, where the person who was supposed to make the submission of the appointment, giving evidence to the public protector, said, and the Premier also said, before this, it was must go to the federal committee. We do want to have that filter, that process. We may well have glossed over the issue of competence, and it's something that even our own conference has insisted we should now do, which is currently underway. But as political parties, we do want people who will go and implement the political mandate. And I also refer to the OECD paper on this matter, that the political involvement in administration, it was said in that paper, is essential for the proper functioning of democracy. And I would still insist that that is a consideration that we need to have in mind. Whilst saying that the deployment committee would always use the soft approach, which to Mr. Pretorius appears like it's a command and instruct approach, I would say, even if that may well be so, in the end, the safety of this process is that the final appointing entity in government or even on a board of directors, because in the end, the board of directors is the one that will say yea or nay for some appointments. So that provides the safety net or process. So I know that the issue of deployment has arisen as a major issue, but I would like to suggest that much as it has, where the deployment has resulted in people who are incompetent, I will concede that that was an error. But where deployment leads to people who are competent, but who are also able to execute the mandate that the governing party has, as I have alluded to, the OECD recognizes that, and other political parties in the country also recognize that. As political institutions, we are elected to execute a particular mandate. And when you appoint people, you want people who are well synchronized or will synchronize their work and activities with that mandate. But people who will also have competence and exercise independence. And I think that is the most important part, where they will have independence of action and execution, but within the broad framework of a particular mandate to fulfill what the organization will have set itself to achieve.
All right. Perhaps just to illustrate the general point I was making by relation to specific wording in the minutes, Mr. President, on the 20th of January 2020, in relation to appointments in the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, it's recorded in the minute, the committee resolved to accept the three proposals. In other words, final decision. Under the head, the Department of Public Service and Administration, the committee resolved to accept the first woman and candidate to be a Director General at that level. Under the Department of Mineral and Energy, the committee resolved to accept the Minister's proposal and that the Minister must further engage with the DSG. Under Defence, the board proposed the name of the current acting CEO to be considered, which is what the Minister came to present. The committee allowed the Minister to go ahead with the process, but was also reminded that in future she must work with the Office of the DSG. The opposite happened on the 30th November 2020. Department of Transport, Minister Mbalula. The presentation was not accepted by the Deployment Committee. There were issues raised with regard to processes being followed and the candidates and the makeup of the board. The item was sent back to be refined. Plenty of examples of that, but if you wish to debate it again tomorrow, we can do so. That is just one aspect of the evidence. The other aspect of the evidence, of course, is the contemporaneous evidence given by various people before the Commission, which the Chair will take into account in making his decision. There are two other matters that arise. I don't know that we can go into the issue of political theory too much, but there's an interesting minute in the bundle where a member
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius, are you moving away from the deployment committee matters?
No, I'm dealing with two more issues.
You're still okay, yes. All right.
If I may, Chair.
Yes, no, that's fine. But maybe let me ask this question, Mr. President.
Yes, please.
Within the context of the practices of the deployment committee, how it deals with matters. What would be the role of, I don't know whether it's a principle or what it is, but namely that there is only one center of power. It is the party. If that is still the position, I know at some stage there were issues about whether there are two centers of power, government and party, but it seems to me that it may well be that if that is the principle, that it would contemplate that the real decisions are taken within the party. So what would be the role of that principle within the context of the work of the deployment committee?
Well, Chair, yes, the party is where power resides. Our democracy is such that it delineates political parties as the vehicles through which the masses of our people demonstrate their support through their votes for a party that then finally has representatives in parliament, in the cabinet, and so forth. So the party then plays a key role. But the party is just one of the actors in our democracy. It's not the only actor, and in the end, when we're talking about the state, you look at the state, what makes up the state is the three arms of the state, so the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, and there are a whole number of other institutions that finally make up the broader state that we talk about. So the party does play a role, and when it comes to matters of governance that impact either on the executive or the legislature, it does play a role. So therefore, its decisions I regard as proposals as they finally go forward, either to the executive or to parliament. For instance, a party will take a decision that we need a piece of legislation, say, on gender-based violence, that those who get involved in either murdering or raping women should be sentenced to 20 life sentences. It becomes a proposal by the party that has to be filtered through another institution, which would be your parliament. And to the extent that it enjoys support, then it becomes the order of the day. Similarly, even with the cabinet, not every member of the cabinet sits on the decision-making structures of the party, and they may well have views that are not completely in line with what the party may well be saying, particularly when it comes to other key principles such as competence, such as integrity, and all those values. And they may well raise an issue and say, but this person that is being proposed, much as they've been proposed by the party, is not the best person that we should have. And I give you another good example, and this I encounter all the time, where, yes, the party may the proposal may well come from government to the party about appointing certain people, and you find that there isn't any gender balance. Maybe there's just one female and others are male. It'll be sent back, and the party will say, no, this is where the party's insistence has counted for a lot. It will say, send it back. We're not prepared to adopt this. And when it comes to youth deployment as well, that we need more young people to be brought into structures. So the party then, for lack of a better word, then becomes a filter, and a very positive filter. And now more and more focusing on competence, on professionalism and capability to do the work, but finding a balance. And another balance would be on demographic balance of our country. And sometimes the temptation is we will just take mostly males and mostly African, and the party will say, no, this does not represent the demographic composition of our country. So send it back, and then you have to juggle again. So the party then plays an important role, and it is a standard bearer, and it wants to insist on the values of itself. It's got values, and values that are representative of what the people of South Africa would like to see.
Thank you. Mr. Pretorius.
In that regard, in fairness to you, Mr. President, there is at least one occasion in the minutes where demographics is emphasized as a principle in favor of a white candidate, in fact. So I understand that point. And it may be that the process of appointments is secondary to the quality of the appointments that are ultimately made, but that's another issue that we will deal with later. But an interesting point in relation to the question that the chair asked, there's a passage in the minute which illustrates the frustration on the part of a member of the deployment committee, saying that people accountable to the committee don't really understand the principle of democratic centralism. What does that mean?
Well, democratic centralism is a political concept. That's a fairly straightforward one. It basically means that when a higher body takes a decision, and I can give it to you more colorfully in terms of, of the field that you operate in, acting Chief Justice. When the Constitutional Court takes a decision on any matter, that is the end. Every other court will follow the dictum or the decision that's been taken by the Constitutional Court. So being a political organization, in order to have discipline, in order to have proper organizational processes, democratic centralism means that when a higher body takes a decision, like in our case, when conference takes a decision, it is binding on everyone, on all the structures. When the National Executive takes a decision, even if you may not agree with it, just like the Constitutional Court takes a decision, even if you may have different views and may not agree with what the Constitutional Court has decided, it is binding, because as a society we've signed a contract with one another that there will be one arbiter of all our matters and disputes. And similarly in a political organization, as certainly in the ANC, that is the case. The contract that each one of us signs when we join is that the upper structure on taking a decision is binding on everyone. And that is why it is a sign of indiscipline in the African National Congress for anyone to then want to use a word like disobey and not follow the decisions of a higher structure. It is looked upon in a very dim way, and it shouldn't happen, because that's how we balance our activities in society in relation to judiciary and also in relation to our own organization. So that's what democratic centralism means.
And the term was used, in fact, in the context of, in this case, the centre being the deployment committee. But if we may move on, there is one issue that I should raise with you, Mr. President, in relation to a meeting of the deployment committee of 22 March 2019. You want to look at it, it's in the bundles in front of you. But I'm just going to summarize what the meeting determined. The meeting noted that the Judicial Services Commission was considering the filling of vacancies in the judiciary. The Deployment Committee recommended 2 justices to seats to fill vacancies in the Constitutional Court. It recommended a judge to fill a position on the Supreme Court of Appeal and in other capacities as well, including Deputy Judge President in a province. So the question arises is, what is the committee doing recommending appointments to the judiciary?
Chairperson, I go back to my earlier explanation that the deployment committee, particularly in a case like this, would play the role of saying, there is a vacancy, and it often happens when another person who's been deployed in government, who would normally be your Minister of Justice, saying, hey, there are vacancies. But the deployment committee knows that at best, all it can ever do is to note, 1, that there's a vacancy, 2, that there are certain names that could, be proposed. And having done that, it also knows very well that it is not the appointing structure. And by definition, by the way our Constitution works, it could never, ever have a judge appointed, because that is a process that is done through the JSC, and what comes out of the JSC is the will of those people who sit on the JSC. But what that deployment committee has often insisted on, Acting Chief Justice, is that we need to have a gender balance. We need to have a demographic balance. And that message often, is raised more regularly and more pointedly by the African National Congress. And I can say, as a deployee of the ANC, that the fact that today we've got so many female judicial officers, it's because the ANC, and you could say, through various structures, has been insisting. It could be the ANC Women's League, it could be the ANC itself, and so on, has been insisting that we must have more female judicial officers. But we must also have a balance. There must be a demographic balance. We must have people of Indian origin, colored, Africans, and whites. And that has been, without any doubt or equivocation, been the insistence of the party that I lead. And so in that regard, I think we should look at it positively. Positively because it has really insisted on this approach. To the extent that people want to look at it negatively, you need to be alive to the fact that, if anything, it was just identification of names and being aware, but in the end, the ANC does not decide and cannot decide. And I would be the first to say, you cannot, as the ANC, choose judges. And that is why it was the ANC itself that insisted that the Constitution should be crafted in the way that it is to be able to have that level of non-partisanship, independence, and you must have all those people who sit on the JSC. And it is something that I feel strongly about.
Well, there is the question, Mr. President, whether if the ANC or the deployment committee, maybe let's say the ANC, wants to influence the appointment of certain people within government, whether it should not do that transparently, so that everybody knows, rather than do it in some office somewhere where there is no transparency, and you end up with, in the case of a minister who may be coming to an interview, to interview candidates for a certain position, on the basis that the deployment committee has said it should be so and so. And yet there are a number of candidates. But apart from the minister, nobody else knows that there is this influence that has been given to the minister that it should be so and so. So there is the question whether if they want to influence appointments, they shouldn't do it transparently, as opposed to doing it in this way. Maybe I shouldn't describe what this way is, but in this way, I mean, if you talk about what Mr. Pretorius was referring to, where they were discussing candidates for various courts as judges, you have in the JSC members of parliament,
Yes.
who are members of the ANC. And one would have thought that the ANC would take the position that says members of parliament who are members of the ANC know what the ANC stands for, know what the ANC would like to see happen in the judiciary, those issues of demographics and whatever. So in making their own contribution in a transparent way, because the JSC process is transparent, they will be doing so knowing what the ANC would like to see. And therefore you don't have this situation where in some office in Luthuli House, candidates for judgeship is being discussed by people whose views will not be subjected to public scrutiny, as would happen with members of the JSC. And candidates won't get a chance to defend themselves or say, but, I should be appointed because of ABCD, when the deployment committee said, no, we think so and so is the right one.
Chairperson, I think it is a suggestion that in a number of instances does get implemented. And I will cite one recent example where, for instance, the officials of the ANC decided that a particular person should be deployed as, and I can speak about it now, as the Speaker of Parliament, And then the caucus of the ANC then meets and then decides that, yes, we want to propose this person, so that is transparent. The one that may not have been transparent is what the officials decided. It could only be transparent if, after the officials having taken the decision, then publicize it that we are going to suggest that to caucus that this person should be nominated. I think it's an interesting proposition, which, as I said, does get implemented at times. And I recall, and I'll cite another example, I recall the question that was put to me when we had to appoint the NDPP of the NPA. And the question, I decided as president that I wanted to open it up, to make it transparent and to have an interview process, and nominations should be made, which was quite new, but it happened, and maybe I'll talk about it later. It was a process where names were put forward, and the question was asked of me whether I, as president, want to single out one person. And I held back, and I said, it might be a difficult one, because let me let the process unfold, because in the end, I have to make the call or the decision. So it is a proposition that is interesting, where to remove this shroud of secrecy, maybe the party should be able to show its hand that this is how we would like to do it. And I guess it happens in other environments worldwide. Because in the end, political parties do have their preferences when it comes to various positions. And I know that in the US, for instance, parties do say, we prefer this one as the Chief Justice and this one as the Judge of Appeal and all that. And we don't do that. And maybe we need to grow up and see how best the democratic process can mature at that level.
Thank you. Mr. Proteus.
Just to refer finally back to the meeting of the 22nd of March of the Deployment Committee in relation to appointments to the judiciary. This is not a case, Mr. President, of the party recommending or even insisting that certain principles be followed in the composition of the judiciary. This is a case where the committee actually recommended named judges, which is something different, or candidates for the bench. And in the context of the policy of democratic centralism, clearly the recommendation of a particular name for a particular post must have been intended to influence the decision of the Judicial Service Committee. Otherwise, what would be the point? These recommendations would be clearly and probably communicated to the members of the Judicial Service Committee in order to influence them in their decision.
Well, I would say, maybe I'll go back to what I said, where I say that the real safety for the process is that the Deployment Committee is not the appointing entity. You may well say influence. Yes, political party will always seek to influence, precisely what you were also saying, that maybe if you want to influence, do it transparently. And I would buy into that. Do it openly and say, we support this one and that one. And in the end, even the public does get involved sometimes when there's, nominations for judges or top positions. They will say, this one is preferable, and when that person has not been appointed, there's an outcry that, they left out this one, and so on. So influence, yes, but appointment, no. Because in the end, the ANC Deployment Committee is not the appointing structure. And whatever the appointing structure is, including the president, when finally names, as our process dictates, names are presented to the president will also take into account the processes that took place in the Judicial Services Commission. So I can hear Mr. Pretorius is going very hard on this issue of influence, but I'd like to say, whatever the influence would be, will always be tempered by the inability of the ANC Deployment Committee to appoint. It does not appoint and should not appoint.
Of course, what is quite obvious, Mr. President, when we discuss this is that the influence of the Deployment Committee may be quite weighty, particularly on those members of the JSC who are ANC MPs, and they might not want to go against such an important structure of the ANC if it has already indicated its preference. And that may be unsatisfactory because, well, I don't know at what stage that recommendation was made in that case, but if it is made before the interviews, for example, it may well be that it would have the effect that some ANC members who are MPs, who are in the JSC, might be unduly inclined towards a particular candidate in circumstances where they should be quite open. You know? So I'm just saying, it's one thing to say the Deployment Committee is not the appointing authority.
Yes.
But the reality might be that once the Deployment Committee has made its preference clear, already a member, maybe I should say, a disciplined member of the ANC who, would be inclined to put a lot of weight on that recommendation in circumstances where he or she should approach the interviews in a very open-minded manner.
Chairperson, I think we must accept that we live in a world where lobbying takes place for placement of people anywhere, where lobbying, there are sometimes lobby groups, lobbyists and all that, people who for one reason or other would prefer certain persons or candidates to be placed in certain positions. That happens all over the world all the time. Be it, in a lowly position or a high-placed position. So if one accepts that, there will be people and groups of people who will sort of articulate their preferences. It should not be seen as something that is evil or dastardly wrong. If it is meant to achieve illegal, unlawful ends, then there is a problem. But if it is meant that there should be names that can be put forward, for instance, to achieve a particular purpose, like we want more women in the judiciary, and we know this lawyer and that person who should be put forward. I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with it, because otherwise, how do we achieve the transformation that we seek to achieve? Will it happen of its own volition? How will it happen? It will happen because people are lobbying or are articulating those positions. And I'd like to suggest that unless the proposition that's being put forward is that this resulted in unlawfulness, in something completely wrong, and should not happen at all, then I will take the point. But the proposition you put forward that maybe it should happen transparently appeals to me, because then it no longer is done in the dark corners, if one wants to say the committee operates in those. It is done openly and transparently, and it's certainly something that I would like to take up for debate and discussion in my party, because to me it makes a lot of sense.
No, I think what I was putting to you is more in the context of there being no transparency.
Yes.
So if there is no transparency, this lobbying or whatever is happening secretly.
Yes, yes.
But where it's transparent,
Yes.
so it can be debated, yes. It can be looked at, can be scrutinized.
Yes.
That might stand on a different footing, where there is transparency. I think part of the problem is where it's maybe secret is the right word. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you and I have never agreed on anything, Acting Chief Justice. On this one, we agree.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Pretorius.
In your recent answer, Mr. President, you raised the issue of international practice. May well be, for example, the example that springs to mind was the appointment of the Supreme Court in the United States of America.
Yes.
The point, I think, is that our Constitution demands the highest standards, even compared to international jurisdictions.
Indeed.
And it is those standards that we apply here. But in relation to constitutionality of the deployment policy and practice, the chair will decide. It's a legal question ultimately that I'm not sure should be debated. But would you concede that loyalty to the party or party membership should never be a determining factor in appointment to public office?
Yes, I would say that. And even this decision that was taken by the party at its conference was that we should lay more emphasis on capacity, professionalism, and also non-partisanship. Because that is the best way any civil servant would be able to serve the people of South Africa. So, yes, I would.
And one is conscious, of course, of evidence in relation to loyalty or party loyalty, again in relation to appointments to public office that has been given by the former president, but that's a matter of record. I needn't debate that with you. If I may go to the second issue, unfortunately, briefly, and that is the question of discipline and accountability. You gave quite stark evidence last time around, Mr. President, in relation to corruption within the ranks of the ruling party and its prevalence over a period of over 20 years. That's a matter of record. going to go back there. But there are two issues arising out of that evidence. The one is specificity, and the second is accountability. In relation to specificity, the chairperson did ask last time round. The chairperson said, I would like you to identify the actual areas where you say as a party we have done our homework. We think this is where we did not do what we were supposed to do properly. This is where we did something we should not have done. So we identify exactly areas where as a party you say, yeah, we did not do things the way we should have, and we acknowledge. And the point of that question is highlighted by the chair when he says, then one can look at what should be put in place for the future so that there is no repeat. And that's been partly discussed now in relation to the issue of transparency. And perhaps in relation to specificity, we can talk more tomorrow when give evidence in the capacity as your role as president, because there are certain issues that must be discussed in that regard. But again, we asked for documents. We requested the ANC disciplinary records, and what we received were records of the ANC's National Disciplinary Committee and the National Disciplinary Committee of Appeal for the period 2014 to 2021. And although there are occasions when party members are disciplined for a range of internal party matters, we did not find in those documents a single case of an ANC member being disciplined in relation to corruption in those documents. Now, given the prevalence of corruption, which has been conceded, and given the period of time over which this corruption has been identified, since the 1990s, to date, not to 2017, 2018, not to 2017, 2018, to date, is it not a matter of concern that the party has not generally, there may be single exceptions, generally called to account in the context of the party itself, people found guilty, accused of corruption? It's a matter of concern, I put it.
Yes, it is a matter of concern. It is a matter that I sought to address in my appearance here. And I did say that there has been contestation within the party on a number of matters, but especially this one. And in that regard, I did concede that the party, for the most part, did not really live up to the value system that is the bedrock of its existence, which was put in place by the founding fathers and mothers of the organization, and that in latter days there was a lapse. And in addressing my letter as president of the ANC to members, I did decry this, and I raised it. And it is on issues of dealing with corruption that I said we must draw a line in the sand. We must now decide as the ANC that we are now going to take the issue of corruption seriously. And the diagnostic report that was tabled at our 54th conference also speaks to this. The renewal process that we've been involved in, that we are involved in now, also talks to this. Yes, there have been some cases which may not have surfaced at the level of the NDC and NDCA where yes, discipline was taken on corruption matters, but they have not been as overarching as they should be. But we have now said, we've drawn a line in the sand, and with the resolutions that were taken at the 54th conference, much as there's been contestation within the party itself, the membership has embraced this, and the issue of discipline and accountability is being taken up much more seriously. And we as a party have also realized what our lackadaisical approach to this has meant to the party in terms of support, because our surveys, our research has told us that ordinary people abhor corruption, and they've not always seen the ANC as taking action against those in its own ranks who have been involved in corrupt acts. But now the game has changed. The line has been drawn in the sand, and the ANC is saying that we are renewing ourselves. And we are, Chairperson, possibly the only party in the land which has borne its own chests and said that we are prepared to hang out our linen in the open, and now, having drawn the line in the sand, we are going now to be very serious about dealing with corruption, because we've realized that corruption actually militates against the interests of our people. You may well say, well, why didn't you do so over a period of so many years? But it's better late than never. And in this case, we are serious about what we are saying. Thank you.
We will, thank you, Mr. President. We will deal with one pertinent series of examples in this regard, and in your deal with your capacity, or in your capacity as President of the country, but that will be tomorrow. For the moment, I must retire to the bench, and the bomb squad must take over.
The bomb squad?
The three other
So they have
evidence
a bomb squad?
leaders.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure they'll be very gentle. May we take 5 minutes for the changeover?
Before we do that, Mr. Pretorius, I'm not sure I understood where you would like the President to deal with that question that I'd raised with him, namely that I wanted the President to identify the areas where they say, as the party, we have reflected and we have identified that this is where we didn't do what we were supposed to do, this is where we did what we were not supposed to do. Because I did, when I looked at the affidavit that has been prepared, I didn't pick up where he deals with that. So I'm not sure whether you were suggesting that that be dealt with tomorrow. I just want to make sure.
Yes, Chair. It may disturb the order of things and the neatness of the categories that we're dealing with, but I have drawn the President's attention to the specific question you asked.
Yeah.
Perhaps we could spend some time tomorrow dealing with the direct answer so that the President can consider it.
No, that's fine. I'm quite happy for it to be dealt with tomorrow. I just want to make sure we don't forget about it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we'll deal with it
And
tomorrow.
then, Chair, of course, before my learned friends ask their questions, the President does wish to make an opening statement in relation to his capacity as President of the country.
Okay, all right. Just to make sure we are all on the same page, will your colleagues be questioning the President in his capacity as former Deputy President of the country and current President of the country?
Yes, Chair.
Or not for the party?
As I said, there may be some grey areas,
Yeah,
but they
okay.
are minor in
Yes.
quantity.
No, that's
And
fine.
it's, as you stated,
Yeah.
President of the country.
Yeah,
And Deputy
okay.
President of the country.
Okay, no, that's fine. Let's take then about 5 minutes to enable whatever logistical arrangements need to be made. I intend that we take a tea break, our tea break at normal time, which is 11:15. So that will be 15 minutes. That is at 11:15. For now, we are looking at 5 minutes or so. Okay, we adjourn.